of migrants who have died during the Trump administration. It's both children, a record number. I mean, I think the number was 6 from back to last year, and there hadn't been a child death in immigration detention in 10 years. And now you have this latest figure of, what was the number? 24 migrants. These are adults who died in detention, with another 4 dying right after they're released.
Right. So something to keep in mind is that there are various agencies that hold immigrants, asylum seekers, migrants. So we have just been talking about ICE immigration detention. The Customs and Border Patrol also holds people at Border Patrol stations, which are often referred to as hieleras, or ice boxes, by people who are held in them. They always describe them as being incredibly cold. I spent time with a couple of girls who I first reported on back in 2013, and they described in great detail, especially one of them, what the ice box was like. And here we are years later. They have green cards now. They're looking forward to becoming citizens. And when we went back to talk about the conditions in these Border Patrol stations, it was like it could have happened yesterday. I mean, they just described how freezing they were, how the one little piece of Mylar didn't feel like enough for either of them, and the older sister felt so bad for the younger one that she took it and tried to create a second layer for her sister, and she was scared of sleeping through getting her name called, because they say that they were told that if they didn't hear their name, they would stay in there forever. So again, this is stuff that we've heard about for a long time. Unaccompanied minors then who leave the Border Patrol stations are then taken to shelters around the country, which are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. These are all contracted facilities throughout the country, and that's a different department altogether. That's not DHS, but the Department of Health and Human Services. Some of what we found is tremendous abuse, both accusations and proven allegations, as well as in some of these places, the shelters that we do know about, they're not contracted facilities, and yes, people die. There are really horrible conditions in a lot of these places, and as you mentioned, there have been 24 deaths during the Trump administration. That accounts for the 200 or so deaths since we've been keeping track, which is since 2003, I believe. And then there have been 4 deaths immediately after custody. So those are also tricky to track. We think that it's 4 people who died immediately after being released. They may have been in custody when they were taken to a hospital and then paroled, essentially taken out of custody immediately thereafter. But these are pretty high numbers, and again, they come from places in which people have been detailing the horrid conditions for quite a long time.
And out of the Inspector General's report, from your own reporting, do you get the sense that they're actually talking to the detainees, or are they just basically inspecting the delivery of basic services and dealing with the personnel in these facilities?
There's mention in the report where they cite that detainees said such and such things. Detainees noted that not having contact visits was difficult for them, for example. But that their actual perspective isn't included. There are no quotes from the detainees themselves in the report. And again, it's interesting, and I think it validates what people have been saying for a long time. But again, for immigration reporters whose sources are the people who experience these policies, this isn't necessarily anything new. I think the photos do illustrate, however, exactly what has been described to me and many other reporters for quite a long time.
And now the Inspector General report author, John Kelly, not the General John Kelly, who's gone on to the board of another for-profit detention facility, is resigning after the this report has come out. But finally, the Trump administration saying it's going to suspend legal aid programs, recreational activities, even English classes, all education for unaccompanied migrant children jailed in federally run immigration centers. The move drawing condemnation from groups like Amnesty International USA, which wrote, "It's bad enough the Trump administration is trying to normalize the warehousing of children. It's unconscionable that they would so blatantly try to strip them of their rights. Locking up children, then denying them legal aid, education, and even playtime is all part of this administration's cruel efforts to dehumanize people who've come to the U.S. seeking safety." Those are the words of Amnesty International USA. And yet you have President Trump taking $8 billion to build a wall and saying he doesn't have money for kids having classes.
Yeah, again, my reporting partner, Patrick Michaels, actually broke that story on Twitter recently, and it was surprising to see that memo, that email, which internally stated we're not, providing English classes right now. We're not providing football or soccer recreation services. And as you note, there is quite an irony in saying that there isn't funding available for something really basic like, how much does a soccer ball
we're going to have
cost?
to leave it there. Sure, immigration reporter with Reveal. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, and we're asking you to go to the phone. If you appreciate today's program, if you appreciate independent media, if you appreciate Democracy Now!, this daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour, please make your call right now to show your support. The number to call is 877-378-8669. That's 877-378-8669. Your call makes a difference. You can also pledge online at freespeech.org. We have a special gift offering that we are offering you today. And that is a book. It's a pocketbook of a book. It is called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And it's yours for a contribution of $50. If you pledge $75, you get the interview that Juan Gonzalez and I do with Yale historian Timothy Snyder. The book and the DVD are yours together for $100 if you call right now. $100 for book and DVD pack. It is a powerful book. You can read it in a sitting. It begins with the rule, do not obey in advance. And it has an introduction by the Yale historian, which says, history doesn't repeat, but it does instruct. As the founding fathers debated our Constitution, they took instruction from the history they knew. Concerned the democratic republic they envisioned would collapse, they contemplated the descent of ancient democracies and republics into oligarchy and empire. We urge you to call in right now. And then Timothy Snyder talks about what he sees in America today. He began this book after Donald Trump was elected, but before he was inaugurated. He posted a Facebook essay. It went viral. And the book is the outgrowth of that. Again, the book, $50. You can get two of the books. Give one to a library, your high school public library, your college library, perhaps send to a prison library. You can get the book and the DVD pack for $100 or $75 for the DVD alone. But do it now. Make that call, 877-378-8669. You could also come to New York. I am very happy today in the aftermath of last night's dinner and a show experience I had, a life journey discussion with some wonderful people, and I'd like to invite you to come here and do the same. You come to the set, you watch the broadcast live, you drink it in with fair trade coffee or tea, freshly baked bagels, muffins. You get to tour through Democracy Now!, meet the guests in studio, whoever is here that day. If it's Noam Chomsky, if it's, Tim Snyder, if it's Arundhati Roy, if it's Cecile Richards, who knows who will be here? Maybe Jeremy Scahill will be in house. Maybe Isabel Allende has a new novel and you'll be here when she's here. Whoever it is, you'll have an amazing time because you get to meet them. If they're here with a book, they can sign your book. talk to them. Sometimes there are classes here. You can meet the classes. And then you meet the team that makes Democracy Now! Happen. And I get to personally host you for dinner, you and your special guest, because this is for two people. Maybe you want to bring your partner or a daughter, a son, a friend you want to meet up with, an aunt, an uncle, maybe a friend you want to meet up with in New York. Maybe you come from another state. Come to the set, watch the broadcast, and then I host you both for dinner, you and your guest. And if it's your birthday, as we did last night, we will sing a rip-roaring happy birthday. If it's a graduation, an anniversary, a Father's Day, you want to do over a Mother's Day, we urge you to call in. Make that call. Maybe it is just a holiday and you want to come to New York. We'd love to host you here. It's a $2,000 tax-deductible charitable contribution that goes directly to Free Speech TV. I think it's like $167 a month. Or you could do the $2,000. Again, it's a tax-deductible charitable contribution. Get your name in the reservation book before it closes. Maybe you're listening from Tennessee or from Texas. We urge you to call in Michigan, Montana, Maryland. If you live in Missouri or you live in Minnesota, we're urging you to call in. Washington State, we need you. We had a guest on the show today from Portland, Oregon. Maybe you live in Portland, Oregon or Portland, Maine. Give a call right now. Or New Hampshire. Your call makes a difference. Ohio, California, from the north to the south. We urge you to call in. Arizona, Colorado, where Free Speech TV is based. Give us a call. If you live in Denver, if you live in Winter Park, if you live in Boulder, we urge you to call in right now. Whether you pledge $50 for On Tyranny, Yale historian Timothy Snyder's book, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, or $100 for the DVD of our extended interview with the Yale historian, $100 for the book and DVD, or pledge $100 for a Democracy Now! Ceramic mug, or $150 for our Democracy Now! Travel mug. It's got our signature logo on it, or $100 for our Democracy Now! Baseball cap that Danny DeVito loves to wear, or perhaps a Democracy Now! T-shirt or a hoodie. What counts is your call, or simply pledge to keep independent media alive. Again, if you want to pledge for dinner and a show, not for a day or time, just pledge for dinner and a show. Maybe you're coming to New York in a few weeks. Maybe you're coming in a year. That doesn't matter. What counts is getting your name in the reservation book now. 877-378-8669 or freespeech.org. Pledge there. That number again is 877-378-8669. It is the lifeline of Free Speech TV. Please make your call. You can also pledge online at freespeech.org. But you know, I've been talking about what Timothy Snyder says. Let's go to what he says. The interview that Juan Gonzalez and I do with him. Please call in even as we play this interview, because the more you call in, the faster you call in, the more we can bring you the content. And that's what we're here for, day in and day out across the week, bringing you information from people who are the experts, whether they've studied an issue, they're the experts in their own lives. This is Yale historian Timothy Snyder, who wrote the book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Please call in right now. The book and DVD for a $100 contribution, plus it makes you a member of Free Speech TV. 877-378-8669. Let's go to that interview. I began by asking Professor Snyder if he thinks we're descending into tyranny.
So I guess the place to start would be with a quotation. Like the framers of the Constitution, I'm not an American exceptionalist. I'm a skeptic. My tendency is to look at examples from other places and to ask what we could learn. The point of using the historical examples is to remind ourselves that democracies and republics usually fail. The expectation should be failure rather than success. The framers, looking at classical examples from Greece and Rome, gave us the institutions that we have. I think our mistake at present is to imagine that the institutions will automatically continue to protect us. My sense is that we've seen institutions like our own fail. 20th century authoritarians have learned that the way to dismantle systems like ours is to go after one institution and then the next, which means that we have to have an active relationship both to history so that we can see how failure arises and learn from people who try to protect institutions, but also an active relationship to our own institutions, that our institutions are only as good as the people who try to serve them.
Well, Professor Snyder, in terms of the rise of tyranny in the 20th century, clearly the rise of fascism came in the period after World War I. The masses of people in the world have been exposed to these imperialist wars, and there was tremendous insecurity. Do you see, what parallels do you see between that period in the 30s and our situation today?
That's a wonderful question, because it helps us see how history can brace us, can give us a kind of grounding. When we think about globalization today, we imagine that it's the first globalization, that everything about it is new, and that's just not the case. The globalization we're in now is the second one. The first globalization was the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when there was a similar expansion of world trade, export-led growth, and interestingly, there was also a similar rhetoric of optimism. The idea that trade would lead to enlightenment, would lead to liberalism, would lead to peace. That pattern of the late 19th century, we saw it break. We saw the First World War, as you say, the Great Depression, the Second World War. One way to understand all of that is the long failure of the first globalization. Once we have that in mind, we shouldn't be surprised that our own globalization has contradictions, has opponents, that it generates opposition, that it generates ideas of the far right, sometimes the far left, that are against it. So history instructs us that there's nothing new or nothing automatic about globalization, but it also instructs us that there are people who lived through the end of that first globalization, the kind of people I cite in the book, Hannah Arendt, Viktor Klemperer, who observed these effects and then gave us very practical advice about how we can react. So part of our own misunderstanding of globalization, that it's all new, is that history doesn't matter precisely because it's all new. What I'm trying to say in the book is, no, the opposite. We've seen globalization fail before. We've seen fascism rise. We've seen other threats to liberalism, republics. What we should be doing is learning from the 20th century rather than forgetting it.
You wrote a Facebook post in November. Tell us what you wrote about when Donald Trump was elected.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about the Facebook post, I wrote it right after the election, and it was the first thing that I did, and it was these 20 lessons. It was an attempt to compress everything that I thought I understood about the 20th century into very brief points that would help Americans react, because I had this strong feeling, I think it turned out to be correct, that there would be tens of millions of Americans who would be surprised and disoriented and shocked by the election of Mr. Trump, and would be seeking some way to react. And I did it as quickly as I could, because it's very important in these kinds of historical moments to get out front. The tendency to, or the temptation to normalize is very strong. The temptation to wait and to say, well, let's see what he does after the inauguration. Let's see who his advisors are. Let's see what the policies are. That temptation generates a normalization, which is already happening in the United States. And so I was trying to get out front and give people very practical day-to-day things that they could do. But what stood behind all of that was a lifetime of working on the worst chapters of European history, a sense of how things can go very wrong. What also stood behind it is my friendships with my teachers and also my students from Eastern Europe, people who have their own biographical connection either to the authoritarianisms of the 20th century or, sadly, the new authoritarianisms of the 21st. It's that a little bit which helps me to see that these kinds of things can happen to people like us, but also that there are practical ways that people like us can respond.
I wanted to ask you about the first lesson you talk about in your book, especially in light of the realities that in our day and age, clearly authoritarianism has enormous more power of surveillance and social control of populations. You write in your first lesson, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. I think about that in terms of the enormous gravitation of the population towards social media, and then the ability of states and corporations to actually monitor and control what people say and do and shop and everything they're thinking about.
Yeah, so I agree with that completely. The historical basis of that first lesson, don't obey in advance, is what historians think we understand about authoritarian regime changes, and in particular, the Nazi regime change of 1933. Historians of Nazi Germany disagree about a lot of things, but one of the few things we agree about is the significance of adaptation from below in 1933. When we look at Hitler in retrospect, we sometimes have a tendency to think of him as a kind of supervillain who can do anything. But in fact, the lesson of 1933 is that consent from below matters a lot. Not consent necessarily in the sense of voting or marching or anything active, but consent in the sense of bystanding, going along, making mental adjustments. So the point of don't obey in advance is not to give your consent in that way, which is very important, because if you do just drift at the beginning, then psychologically you're lost. Or to put it a different way, if you don't follow lesson 1, don't obey in advance, then you can't follow lessons 2 to 20 either. Politically, it's also really important, because the time which matters the most is the beginning, where we are now. Right now, we actually have much more power than we think we do. Our actions are magnified outwards now. When protest becomes illegal or dangerous, this is going to change. But right now, Americans actually have more power than they think they do. And your point actually magnifies all of this, because one of the reasons you shouldn't obey in advance is that when you do, you're actually giving power ideas. They don't necessarily have plans. They don't necessarily know what they can do. But when we lean towards what they think they want, and social media is a very good example of this, then we give them ideas. We teach them what they can do. So in our real lives and in social media, it's very important not to obey in advance, because you're absolutely right. That information is being collected and collated and considered.
Number 2, Timothy Snyder, in your 20 lessons from the 20th century, is defend institutions. Explain.
Well, that's the second most important lesson. It's number 2 for a reason. I have in mind, above all, the constitutional institutions, but I also have in mind later on in the book other kinds of institutions like professional or vocational orders, and we need to be able to form ourselves up into non-governmental organizations, because it's not just that we have freedom of association, it's that freedom itself requires association. We need association to have our own ideas confirmed, to have our confidence raised.